Only in America.
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 This week, one family seeking protection believed in the promises of America. But what happens when reality sets in about the challenges along the way?
So I think that realization that, we did everything right, they did everything right, they spent all their time, all their money, all their resources trying to prepare their case and set their children up for their future. And if something just came down to a very arbitrary chance, I think that was one of the biggest disillusioning things for them.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani, and this is Only in America. I often say that immigration is not about politics or policy. It's about culture, values, and ultimately, people. Because the ugliness of the politics of immigration, the brokenness of our immigration policies, are all filtered through cultural and values frameworks to impact mothers, fathers, children. Real people with real lives. Over the first 4 episodes of this series, How Did We Get Here?, we talked a lot about politics and policy. But all of that pales in comparison to the actual human impact of flawed policies. Over the course of the series, we've seen how the perception of entering legally or doing it the right way has changed over the past century, how our laws have been designed to prioritize certain groups over others, and how those groups have changed over the years. We saw how in the 1960s, the U.S. finally changed its racial quotas policy to allow immigrants from all parts of the world and to expand family-based immigration. We also took a look at the push in the 1980s to legalize about 3 million undocumented immigrants who had been here without proper authorization. But obviously, there's still work to be done to ensure that our laws reflect who we are as a country. To live up to the call of being a welcoming nation, America needs to ensure that we are protecting people who are vulnerable and accepting people who will make our communities better for everyone. This week, we're going to hear about the consequences of our immigration system's shortfalls through the lens of one asylum-seeking family's story. What happens when you fear religious persecution in your home country, but you're rejected when trying to escape?
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
The word refugee is thrown around a lot, but who does it actually refer to? We want to tell you about a new podcast from Virginia Public Media called Resettled. Resettled shares the intimate moments of refugees' lives and explores the policies that shape their future in the United States. From navigating the healthcare system to budgeting for a family with no credit history, hear from resettled refugees not as victims or statistics, but from their experiences firsthand. Listen and subscribe to Resettled wherever you get your podcasts.
My guest this week is Ainee Athar. Ainee is an immigration program manager at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Born in Pakistan, Ainee and her family sought protection from the religious persecution that they faced. But in coming to the U.S., they faced a slew of obstacles over many, many years. Navigating bureaucracies, a rejected asylum application, a failure of an immigration attorney, multiple changes in immigration status, and a harrowing experience with immigration enforcement. After advocating for her family as a young person, now Ainee is playing a critical leadership role in the movement. So let's start with your story. Where are you from?
I was born in Pakistan, but I grew up in Texas, and I consider myself a Houstonian for sure.
A Houstonian for sure. Okay, well, I'm going to put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. So where in Pakistan is the family from?
My family lived in Karachi when we lived there.
And how old were you when you left?
I was 2.
And have you been back at all?
Early on, we went back a couple of times, but at this point, I haven't been back in more than a decade.
And why did the family leave?
So my family is part of a religious community called Ahmadi Muslims, and Ahmadis are pretty widely persecuted in Muslim countries. And when my family made the decision to leave when I was younger, they knew that they wanted to settle in the United States permanently. A lot of my dad's brothers and sisters already lived here. And initially, when we kind of came here, we did pursue other options of getting permanent residency here. Like my dad's an electrical engineer, so the first thing that we tried was an H-1B visa. But it's really the religious persecution and the discrimination that Ahmadis face, which has only gotten worse in Pakistan in recent years. And I won't go into too much detail, but just to share a couple of things about what the situation for Ahmadis is Ahmadis are considered heretics by the Pakistani constitution, and they can't do things like vote. They face an immense amount of violence, and they're often prosecuted under blasphemy laws, which targets religious minorities in Pakistan. And some of the worst domestic acts of terrorism have actually happened against the Ahmadi community. So most people who are Ahmadi and live in a Muslim-majority country actually choose to leave, and they do settle in Western countries like Canada, the United States, and the UK, where they're granted asylum at really high rates.
So then you get to the U.S. Tell me about the first few years for the family. At what point did you realize that you were no longer in Pakistan? Because, coming over at 2, you don't remember that journey, right?
I don't. And I think that's part of the experience of being a young migrant and someone who spent a lot of their youth being undocumented is you don't actually realize that you're not American or you're not from here, because I don't remember growing up in Pakistan all that much. Even though we did go back and forth a little bit, I recognize like this country is my home and this is where I've lived for my whole life. So in Houston, where I spent the largest part of my life, I did grow up in a really diverse community that was also filled with immigrants and refugees and other people who came from really like impoverished and underprivileged backgrounds. So I just thought, my experience, my family's experience was very normal.
So your dad was an electrical engineer, tried to apply for legal status in a few different ways. Tell me a little bit about how the process went for the first 5-10 years.
So while we were in the process for an H-1B status, and again, this is when I was like in high school and younger, September 11th happened, which resulted in a pretty, sudden shutdown of the immigration system. And it also resulted in a lot of applications when the system was opened back up being rejected, particularly from Muslim countries. So I had family members and people who are part of our religious community who suddenly had to deal with like investigations into their case. My family had to deal with a level of that. And ultimately the laws dramatically changed after September 11th for even things like H-1Bs. And so that application, unfortunately, was rejected. At that point, I was in high school and my sister was about to graduate from high school. So it didn't really make sense for our family to try to start over in Canada or to try to start over in another country. And that's when they decided to pursue their asylum case.
And what happened in between the H-1B application being rejected and the asylum case? It was just, what were those conversations like, is what I'm getting at here? How did the family take that?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that because of my agents, especially, but my family really tried to shield me from what this all meant, right? At this point, like I couldn't do things like, again, being in high school, like get a driver's license and things like that. And I think my sister was having questions about how she was going to apply to college and pay for it. And my parents, being parents, really just tried to reassure us and say, Ahmadis are given asylum. Their asylum application is so high in places like the US and Canada. They kept telling us, you don't have anything to worry about, right? But it did feel very uncertain. And I think what really my parents also told themselves was that we've lived in this country for so long. We have tried to do everything we possibly could to stay here and try to be, quote unquote, model immigrants for the most part. We're really active in the community. Our children are in school. To them at that point, even though they were low income immigrants who were still struggling to make a life here, they really did believe in the promise of this country, and they really felt like this country is not going to let us down, and it's like we will be okay. So that's something that I do remember, was that constant reassurance that, why would America let anything happen to us? Like, we have tried our hardest and tried to do our best here.
And at what point were there questions whether or not that was true?
I think it takes a long time for that idealism that many immigrants have about America to kind of be disrupted. But I do think for us, it came when our asylum case was heard for the first time and the case was rejected. One thing that I think a lot of people don't know about the asylum system in America is that as much as it's important to build up your case so it matches the kind of qualifications, it's also up to chance and it's also up to the judge that you might get. This is a situation that's unfortunately gotten worse under the Trump administration, where there have been many judges that have been forced off the bench or retired and replaced by people who have very high rejection rates or people who are otherwise unqualified to determine asylum eligibility. So I remember that my mom carried around that piece of paper that had our initial rejection and the judge's decision. And this judge at the time had, I think, over an 80% rejection rate in the Houston courts. And she would show it to like every lawyer that, she would meet or every legal professional. And they would all say the same thing. They were like, this ruling makes no legal sense. You did everything you could to meet the burden of proof for asylum. And sometimes it just unfortunately comes down to who your judge is. So I think that realization that, we did everything right. They did everything right. They spent all their time, all their money, all their resources trying to prepare their case and set their children up for their future. And if something just came down to a very arbitrary chance, I think that was one of the biggest disillusioning things for them.
And then what happened with the case?
So once we got rejected, we were, advised to file for an appeal. And that's kind of where I would basically start my story. So the appeal was filed basically by the time I was a sophomore in college and I had just started.
So let me just ask one question. I'm sorry. Up to this point, if you don't mind me asking, what's your legal status and your family's?
So our legal status was applicant for asylum, which is not a permanent legal status. It means you have some level of lawful presence. But even things like being able to work, my family relied on having to get their employment authorization every year. And now even that employment authorization piece is coming under attack under this administration. For as long as our asylum case lasted, which was about a decade, if that provision hadn't existed, my family wouldn't have been able to do things like have a basic job.
Got it. Sorry, you were talking about the appeal.
Yeah, so my family filed for their appeal when I was a sophomore in college. And the lawyer at the time that we had basically made a filing mistake, and we didn't know. And for about 3 days, we were overdue in filing the appeal, but we didn't know because the firm had assured us they had already sent out the paperwork. And the way that we found out that we were out of status was ICE actually raided my family's home in Houston. And they detained my mom and dad for a little over a month, and they filed deportation proceedings against all four of us. So when I often tell my story, that's really the place that I start, because that was kind of the make or break moment in terms of really showing me and my family like the situation that we were in and how much we were at the mercy of a very broken and arbitrary system.
What was that month like when your parents were detained? You were in college at that point?
Yeah, it was really harrowing because you just don't know what's happening, right? I was instructed to not contact my parents in detention because the legal advisors for my family were afraid that ICE would also come after me or my sister. And it was just a very difficult thing to explain to the people around me. My family asked me to leave school for a couple of weeks, which caused my grades to suffer. And again, this was in the early 2000s. It was in 2010, and I was at the University of Texas at Austin. This was before DACA. This was before universities were really trying to be as supportive of undocumented students. There was nothing I could do to ask the school for help or to explain to them my circumstances in a way that they understood. But really, for that month, it was quite terrible, and I was just terrified for my parents who were locked up in an immigration detention center.
Did you ever go visit them?
No, I was instructed to basically stay away from them. And also one of the things that we had to do during this time was find new legal counsel because the lawyer that we had that had messed up our case originally abruptly resigned from the case.
So then they're detained for a month, and then what happens?
So when they come out, we start dealing with this reality that we have deportation proceedings filed against us. For, I think it was the first couple of months, my entire family was under immigration surveillance. My parents had to wear an ankle monitor, which was like deeply humiliating experience for them. And then while I was in college, I would actually get check-in calls from ICE where I was like geolocated and had to pick up and let them know where I was. And then we also had to do pretty regular check-ins with them. And the ankle monitor and that kind of stuff only lasted for a couple of months, but the check-in lasted for, I believe, the first year or two.
And how did you explain that to your friends, or did you even explain it?
It was really hard to explain to my friends. Many of them didn't understand what was going on. I explained it to some of them. They just didn't know what to do either. And this is really the time where I started seeking out immigrant students on campus, and there was a growing kind of group of undocumented students who are doing, activism and advocacy on campus. And the isolation was one of the reasons I really sought them out and got involved in immigration activism myself.
Got it. I'm going to come back to that. So, okay, your parents are detained. Eventually, they're released with ankle monitors. There's surveillance. And then what happens to the case?
So we get a new legal counsel, and the Amity community in Houston, which is one of the largest populations of Amities in America, was very supportive of my family and their situation. And they helped us obtain a new legal counsel. Our lawyer ended up being this really amazing guy who is Amity himself and does a lot of pro bono asylum cases. But the deportation proceedings lasted from 2010 to 2017. And what we had to do in that time was for my parents, because they, didn't have DACA or anything like that. Like my sister and I got DACA in 2013 and 14. What we had to do with our parents was work with our local congressional office in Houston every year to basically get them an extension on their deportation case, to ask the congressperson to advocate for that extension directly with ICE. So every single year I had to basically do that for my family.
This was in addition to or on top of applying every year for employment authorization.
Yes.
What year did the family come to the U.S.?
1993.
Wow. So this is over 20 years so far?
Yes.
Wow. So DACA happens. What was that like?
That was a really amazing experience. And it was, I think, one of the first moments that a lot of us, not just in terms of our families, but in terms of the movement, felt like there was hope for the work that we were doing and for the situation that we were in. When I was a college activist, DACA was one of the things I worked on, organizing press conferences and really highlighting the experiences of some of my older classmates who were graduating with all these amazing degrees and were saying, yeah, I'm going to go, wash dishes at this restaurant for cash under the table because even though I have an engineering degree, there's no way that I can work. So I think DACA was a game changer on so many levels. It allowed us to support our families, but it also allowed us to continue to advocate for our communities and the issues that we were working on as undocumented people from a place of security. When I was helping my parents file for the extension every year, one of the things that the congressional office would always write in their request to ICE was that this family has 2 daughters on DACA. And I do believe that if it hadn't been for something like that, ICE would have been less likely to grant those extensions every year.
So at what point did you start organizing full-time, go from student activist to advocate organizer?
Right after college, actually. So I graduated, and then in 2014, my first full-time job was to be the Texas organizer for an organization called Forward US. And I was the first person they hired in Texas, and it was, a very new experience to be organizing full-time, but I had been doing so much of it throughout college, not just in Texas, but around the country, particularly sharing my experience as a Pakistani immigrant about asylum, that I was really excited for this opportunity to pop up.
So there's something about you, Ainee, that I find absolutely amazing. You've gone through the ringer of the immigration system, multiple ringers, you and your family. And then you have gone on to advocate for immigrants and immigration reform. How do you maintain kind of the emotional distance between, your story and the system that you're trying to change?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer. I do think that one of the reasons I got involved in college and activism was because there were a lot of doors professionally that were shut for me, especially because I didn't have work authorization, and this was a little bit before DACA. So getting involved in immigration activism, in addition to the community it provided me, was also just a way for me to grow and to develop some kind of a career. And if I had not been in that situation, I don't know for sure if I would say that I would be doing all of this. So I do think the level of emotional connection that I have to this issue is a really big part of why I'm here. but it's not easy to balance those things. I was at Forward for about 3.5 years, and then I left to go work in local government for some time. And one of the reasons I left was because it was right around the time that my final immigration hearing happened. And I did need some kind of emotional distance from working on this issue, 10 hours a day and then coming home and helping my family kind of go through their own situation. Now that my family is no longer in the situation and we are on the pathway to citizenship, I just think about my mom, and even when everything with our case was settled, she kept telling me that you have an obligation because you got lucky and we got out of this. And really all it is luck. Like, you have the obligation to keep giving back and to keep standing up for the people who didn't have the opportunity that you have. So that's a little bit about where that personal experience really drives me to be where I am today.
And so how was the case resolved?
So I think around 2015, our case was ordered to be reopened by the Board of Immigration Appeals at the BIA, which is a pretty rare thing in general. I think it's gotten even more rare now under the Trump administration. And we had a final immigration hearing in November 2017, and it was ordered remanded, I think, for two reasons. One is the country conditions had changed, and Pakistan had gotten worse for Ahmadis since the first time our case was heard. And the other reason it was ordered reopened was because of legal negligence from our first attorney. And so we got the opportunity to argue the case again. And this is really, the absolute last line for me and my family. And working up to that day in November, we were sitting at home and making plans on what we would do if we lost the case, because we would be deported. And the plan was that, we would try to apply for asylum in Canada, and we would have to sell our house, and we would have to pack a suitcase and go wait at the Canadian border for a church to kind of invite us on the other side and sleep in the church. And so we had all these plans that were basically, okay, how do we start over? So that's how down to the wire that case in November 2017 was. And like actually it happens in a lot of immigration cases, the result was really anticlimactic. We went up against the same judge, and within 45 minutes, she was like, oh, this seems like pretty clear grounds for an affirmative asylum application. And she, ordered asylum granted. And I remember it was so sudden that my mom didn't really believe it had happened. And she kept asking us what just happened? What just happened? And I was like, I think we won the case. But it just goes to show you how these decisions about people's lives and their deaths are tied into these really banal, bureaucratic circumstances, and how surreal that experience is to sit in a courtroom and watch that happen.
So when you say the same judge, is this the same judge who heard the case the first time?
Yeah, it was. It was the same judge.
So that judge went back, looked at the case history, and more or less reversed her initial decision.
Yes.
That's bonkers.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Huh. Okay, that's just bonkers. So you're at Forward, you go work for the local government, the case is resolved, and now you have a very, very important role within the movement. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so I am the program officer on immigration at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is one of the largest philanthropic funders of the immigration space. And I joined CZI in August of 2018.
So what has it been like to see the movement from the perch where you are now?
I wanted to be in a role where I had much more of a strategic perspective on shaping campaigns versus being a frontline grassroots organizer, which is a really rewarding experience, but it's also very difficult. And it did lead to a lot of personal burnout for me. I think that I was really surprised by the fact that in social movements and in the nonprofit ecosystem on any issue, a lot of the decisions around resourcing are made by people who don't have that much contact with nonprofits outside of their philanthropic job. And it really showed me the importance of having people who do have either direct experience in the systems that we're trying to change, or who have worked as frontline organizers or have been on the grant-seeking side of these issues in roles where, resources are being distributed.
And you've played both of those roles.
Yes.
So then when you are thinking about the time ahead, right? So, you have, like I said, you've been through every part of the immigration systems ringer. You have played leadership roles at multiple levels within the movement. How do you see the next 2 to 5 years of the immigrant rights movement? Where do you think it needs to go?
That's a great question. I think what might start is by talking about the scenario of a Biden administration in particular and kind of working from there. So if we have a situation in November where a Democrat does take the White House, I think there's a lot of Americans who believe that some level of immigration reform or overhaul federally is inevitable. And I don't think we should think that it's guaranteed. And I do think we need to be clear that it's still a very uphill battle. I think a lot of nonprofits are clear on this, but maybe the general public is a little bit further away. One of our kind of central perspectives at CZI is that the gridlock on immigration at the federal level is due to kind of two things. One is that for a lot of liberal voters, this isn't necessarily a very motivating issue and not a very salient issue. And you kind of see that when Democrats talk about immigration, they tend to not talk about it, first of all. And when they do, it's in very loose terms, which has unfortunately allowed the narrative to be defined by more extremist elements. And then on the more kind of conservative side, while there are people who could be swayed to think about immigration and the role of immigrants in a more positive way, there's very few folks who are talking about immigration in a positive way to conservative audiences. So I think the thing that we have to think about in the movement under a Biden administration is how do we get more people on our side and make this issue more important for a larger cross-section of voters and for the American public, knowing that there will be issues like climate, like criminal justice reform, like economy, like healthcare reform, which are much more widespread and much more salient for many voters than something like immigration. And so I think our success will depend on our ability to be able to articulate how immigration is part of all of these other issues, right? It's part of criminal justice reform at the local and state level. It's part of climate change. When we talk about rebuilding the economy and whatever that will look like congressionally, there has to be a conversation about rebuilding the legal immigration system. And then there's various aspects of the immigration system that must be rebuilt from scratch, like the asylum system. And so we have to figure out how to have those conversations in a much more broad-based way. I think one of the structural challenges of working in immigration is we do tend to talk to ourselves a lot, and I don't think we will get a lot done if we're not able to really expand our conversation and our narrative about this issue.
So this particular series of episodes is kind of under this theme of how did we get here? In many ways, your story is kind of the perfect example of how did we get here, because all the steps that you went through and the curveballs that were thrown your way. When you look back at the last 10, 20 years of your story, but then even stretch back as you talk to people, what are the most important things we have to keep in mind from history as we're thinking about the future of the movement?
I think that I would draw a lot on the racial justice moment that we're in. The protests that we're seeing around Black Lives Matter and the conversation we're seeing on anti-Blackness and racial inequality in America, the protests are considered the largest mobilization of Americans in history. And I think they're successful because we're able to, these activists have been able to really successfully articulate over a really long legacy of work why police reform and why these kinds of issues of anti-Black violence are actually relevant to everyone, not just to the Black community. And that's the lesson that I would draw most heavily on is we have to figure out how to make our issues relevant to everybody, and that there are some structural challenges that the immigrant rights faces simply because it's a relatively new social movement, I think, compared to other social movements in this country. And it's just important to remember that. But one of the structural challenges that immigrants face is that our base and our people who are the most impacted are often people who cannot participate in the political process in the same way. And it locks us out of a lot of systems and institutions of power. And that's why building up the grassroots power of the movement is so important. But that's why it's also very important to have a very expansive vision that is encompassing of more than just immigrants and immigrants alone. When you look at the success of other social movements, including, I think, the most commonly cited example is how quickly the fight for marriage equality was won, what you find is that they did have a lot of institutional support and institutional advocates. And that doesn't just mean they had more donors or more people who were supporting them, but they had people who were in democratic politics or who were in these positions of power that were able to use their political capital to put this issue on the agenda and to move this issue forward in a really strategic way. And I think the immigration space needs to figure out what that looks like for us. There's people like me who've been in this movement for over a decade now. There's all sorts of amazing directly impacted leaders who are now rising to new and incredible positions. But we do also need to remember, I think it's very common in a lot of social movements to look at strategy from a position of scarcity. And we need to think about how we are growing the pie overall in terms of dollars, in terms of supporters, in terms of organizations, versus just trying to figure out how to allocate the limited resources that we do have available.
Last question for you, Ainee. The name of the podcast is Only in America. Finish the sentence. Only in America, ...
That's an interesting question.
I was totally expecting you to have one ready. I figured you'd done your homework and had already kind of lined one up.
No, I didn't have an answer to this one. Hold on, give me a second. I want it to be good. Okay, if I could give the most articulate answer here, I guess I would say Only in America. Do immigrants always kind of win out in the long term and at the end of the day? And I think that's just something that I actually heard Jose Antonio Vargas say once when I was in college and went to a lecture of his, where he said, when you look at American history, even though we go through these really intense periods of struggle and violence against these kinds of communities and marginalized communities, these communities always prevail. And I do believe that is a really big part of the ethos of this country. And it's certainly something that I think of when I feel like, oh my gosh, we're not going to win or we're not going to get out of this. Like at the end of the day, the immigrants and the marginalized people on a long enough timeline, they've always won.
And I'm just kind of thinking about your family story. I mean, packing up to head to the Canadian border and wait for a church to help you resettle. That's the long haul.
Yeah.
Ainee, thank you so much. Every time I have a chance to talk to you, I just kind of leave the conversation being reminded of not just how incredibly brilliant you are, but how incredibly inspirational you are. So thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
Ainee Athar is an immigration program manager at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. You can find more about Ainee at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And please, while you're there, be sure to listen to the rest of the episodes in our How Did We Get Here series. Tune in next week to hear a sneak peek of our next series of episodes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Finally, I would love to hear your feedback. What did you think of this series? What do you think about the podcast overall? Leave us a review on your favorite platform or shoot me a note. I'm pretty easy to find. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nirani. I will talk to you next week.